Welcome to the Customary Land podcast. I'm your host, Spike Boydell. In this episode, I want to talk about land ownership, and in particular, customary land ownership. I'm going to build this discussion around a paper that I wrote with my colleague, Krishn Shah, in the context of customary land, which in Fiji is known as native land or iTaukei land. And I mention this because whilst I'm going to use Fiji as a case study, the issues I mention are also relevant to other Pacific Island countries, Australia and New Zealand, or indeed any country where customary, indigenous or native land exists, or building on the last episode where native land, customary land should be recognised and exist. So through a philosophical inquiry into the nature of communal land, this episode questions the myth and embeddedness surrounding native title in Fiji. Can we identify an owner of native land? There are many who claim to be native landowners. Indeed, as members of the Vanua, they actually believe themselves to be landowners. Traditionally, culturally, historically, of course, they are, but we've seen elements of arguable dispossession by colonisation, and also through, and I mentioned this last week, the intermediary body, the iTaukei, or it was known as the Native Land Trust Board, it's now known as the iTaukei Land Trust Board in the Fiji example. There's sometimes a difference between belief and actuality. The philosophical inquiry is grounded in legal precedent. Land tenure systems are man-made, but legal clarification is sometimes required to assist in determining the rights of various parties. So I'm going to touch on the three cases of Meli Kayaliavu versus the NLTB, Timothy Bavandra versus the NLTB, and Misio Daikau versus the NLTB, which provide a valuable legal interpretation. When the ordinary individual, who's been seduced by the myth and embeddedness of misunderstanding, comes to realise they don't own anything other than a lifelong right of occupation, guardianship, stewardship, and an obligation for that prudent stewardship, there may be a revolution and a clarion call for modification of the land tenure system. This will only happen when the majority decide where they want to be placed between the extremes of traditional customary ways and Western materialism. This is both a societal and nation-changing decision, and one that must not be taken lightly. I'll provide details of links to the original paper in the show notes, and also relevantly to one from Choeli Bandroka, who wrote on the background to Fiji and the Deed of Cession, and his views, slight counterpoint to some of mine, on where the result of the colonial activities and the establishment of the NLTB, now the iTaukei Land Trust Board, but then the Native Land Trust Board in the 1940s, actually helped concretise certain ways of thinking. I think it's worth highlighting that since Krishn and I wrote the paper, there have been significant political and institutional changes, and I'll flag those as I progress. The focus of the inquiry in this episode is into the nature of Indigenous land ownership in the Fiji Islands. I've devoted considerable time to musing on this perplexing inquiry, and yet, hard as I might try, I've yet to meet an owner of native land per se, in the Western sense. And that's the critical nature. We've got, through the whole, I think, of the Customary Land podcast, we're going to keep coming up with challenges between what we have as Western understanding and customary understanding, as supplanted Western law and as appropriate customary law. So I've met many who claim to be native landowners. Indeed, as members of a Vanua, they actually believe themselves to be landowners, and they're told that they are. And indeed, the legislation refers to landowners, especially when we look at things like the Native Land Trust Act and the establishment of the NLTB, now the TLTB. However, there's sometimes a difference between belief and actuality, and such is the embeddedness of property. There's an established rhetoric that land holds a special place in the Pacific, and nowhere more so than Fiji. Now, this assertion can actually be countered with the argument that land holds a special place in all societies as a basis of wealth and power. The Pacific difference lies in the special fact that only a small percentage of land, by area, rather than by value, was alienated as a result of colonization. Unlike Africa and our Pacific neighbours Australia and New Zealand. In fact, as I allude to in the case of Fiji, somewhere, and it's always been a little vague in sources that I've looked at, but somewhere between 83 and 90% of land is customary land, with about, from what I can tell, 6% land being freehold and 4% of land being state land, historically Crown land. So that leaves us with a sort of slight variance of 7%, but that's not particularly the focus of this episode. There's a burgeoning and plausible contention that a subtle form of alienation, a passing to state control, did actually occur. And this argument will be developed after investigating the nature of ownership of land by the natives of Fiji. What do we mean by ownership? Well, ownership seems to mean different things to different people. The dictionary definition is straightforward. If you own something, it's yours to do with as you please. I think the Latin the Latin root of tenure, tenere, meant to hold something. You have an absolute right over it, if you own something, normally, to preserve it, and it's even yours to destroy, if you want to. It's basically yours. You own it. You can do what you want with it. But in actual fact, in Western terms, you can't, because there are all sorts of restrictions over what you can do with land in terms of planning, legislation, building codes. So you are restricted, but there are systems in place that say it is yours. Well, it isn't fully yours in this Western perspective of fee simple absolute impossession or freehold ownership, albeit, as I say, constrained by planning, taxation, other statutory requirements and obligations. It's an individualistic paradigm, but fee simple absolute in possession, if I go on to continue the definition of freehold, it's free simple absolute in possession there by grace of the Crown in the Westminster or English understanding. And that's really at the root of many of the issues that I see us talking about in the Customary Land podcast. And that's the variation of understanding between and the appropriateness of understanding of a Western or English legal structure that was supplanted to many Pacific islands. Not all of them, because obviously some, like New Caledonia, remain colonies of France and are much more influenced by French legal codes, and places like Vanuatu obviously had the influence of both British and French legal understanding supplanted into it. This is not the essence of Indigenous land ownership, which is philosophically vested in communalism. To explore this communalism further, we find it's about relationships. Nongo kalu, nongu venua, meaning my God, my land. The relation between God and land is somewhat significant, and when we talk about God, we talk about spirit rather than the supplanted Methodist God. But if we acknowledge the concept of nongo kalu, nongo venua, then we accept that there's no separation between God and the land. The land ultimately belongs to God or whatever higher spirit realm you may subscribe to. This links in with the basis of land as a gift or indigenous right for occupancy for the duration of life. We can't take the land with us when we leave this earth, whatever our religious belief. If land inherently belongs to God and we accept we're all God's creatures, the suggestion that Indigenous Fijians own the land is obviously flawed, as we would be arguing that owning land means that we are in essence owning God, or likewise that God, or part thereof, belongs to us. And of course we know that this cannot be so. Is this contextual or applicable on a general basis? Well, within the Nongo Kalu Nongo Venua, our God, our land, we find an inseparable relationship between God, humankind, and the earth. Ultimately, we're all destined to become one with the earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, irrespective of our race or religion. This communalism in a Fiji context can be seen as land stewardship or guardianship associated with an enduring sense of place or relationship to village and community. This enduring physical and spiritual relationship remains grounded in tradition and custom that is yet to be diluted by the ravages of globalization. We contend that the word ownership has been wrongly adopted into everyday parlance in the Pacific when used in the context of relationship to or rights over land. The individual Fijian has rights over customary land, that's not in question. However, the nature of those rights is actually open to debate. What is the place of the individual within the communal relationship to place or village? If, in isolation, the individual had ownership, then that individual could pass on his or her right to you or any third party for money or any alternative form of consideration. And then you could become the owner after an exchange of a legally binding contract. And indeed, there's evidence to suggest that is how things were in Fiji prior to the Deed of Cession to Queen Victoria in 1874. And in the early days of Fiji under the Crown, there were efforts to try and resolve some of these issues, which I'll elaborate on a little bit shortly. Yet we know this can't be the case, this can't happen. You can't alienate customary land at an individualized person-to-person level because it's not the individual's to sell. However, much as they may want to liberate any financial wealth associated with a particular parcel of land. This then is the dilemma of communalism and ownership. Nonetheless, this non-alienation of land seems to have been the vision of Sir Arthur Gordon rather than the practices of the people of Fiji. For about, as I said, 10%, Arthur Gordon, was the first Governor General of Fiji. Because, as I say, around, and these figures always stay a bit vague, 10% of a land was alienated and is now what we know as freehold title in Fiji, which should be fee simple, absolute impossession, there by grace of a crown, but it's there by grace of a state, or it's state land, that 10%. It's also intriguing to question how, if communal ownership did not have the power to alienate, then these sales of freehold land would never have been considered as valid legal transfers. However, contemporary communalism, after intervention by Sir Gordon, has taken away the rights of alienation from the native owner. And that's also been perpetuated by the establishment of the Native Land Trust Board and the iTaukei Land Trust Board, which, as I've said, is a blessing for Fiji, but also a possible curse for Fiji, and will be the focus of a subsequent episode in its own right. So a gift from God, as I say, can become a curse if it's abused or mishandled. So we've tried to rationalise the nature of Fijian land rights within our experience from other societies around the world. Take the Westminster legal system, for example, which is widely accepted within post-colonial society. The nearest parallel to an individual Fijian's right within the Westminster framework is the tenancy for life. Such tenure comes with a range of onerous, restrictive covenants within the Fijian context of land. These include prohibitions on sale, exchange, assignment, and in many cases, if reserve or village land, the ability to sublet. Strong land rights, most definitely, but hardly land ownership in the way we may perceive land ownership in the West, or as I can own land here, which is still, in essence, under the control of the Crown and currently King Charles III. But the discussion on the Republic is a whole other episode for the future. This begs a question then, who does the land actually belong to in Fiji? At one level, we say the Vanua, people of the land from the land. The land and Vanua is, as I discovered from my somewhat challenged studies of the Fijian language, the word Vanua has more and deeper meanings than just about any other word. It's a multifarious word. It has meanings of land, it has meanings of personage, spirituality, and place. So the land belongs to the Vanua within a philosophy of communal stewardship, rather than in individualistic ownership. This stewardship, or guardianship, is embraced in both the tenets of Nongo Kulu, Nongo Vanua, and also the tenancy for life model, with responsibility to take care of land for the spirits of one's ancestors, used for one's life and protection, to ensure sustainability of the land for one's descendants who are yet to grace this earth. Well, isn't this the most worthy of philosophies, a precursor to everything that's good in land care and permaculture, and a philosophy that strives for harmony in the relationship between God, humankind, and the earth? Indeed, it's somewhat at odds with the global individualistic aspirations of commercialism and the economic rationality of the likes of De Soto, yet so much in harmony with the notion of customary land tenure. It always frustrates me that I mention De Soto, because I have to then go ahead and explain why De Soto isn't appropriate in a Pacific context. So in explaining why capitalism works in the West and fails elsewhere, Hernando de Soto makes a case for individualizing land ownership and land title in order that land title can be used as security against financial borrowing. Such economic rationalism is at odds with the pervading sociology of Fijian society. Hitherto, there's not been a savings mentality in the Pacific. In part, this is attributable to the lack of climatic seasonality, and certainly in the case of Fiji, an abundance of subsistence food from the land and ocean. This is in contrast to European and non-tropical counterparts who've always had to hoard food and grain to let them survive the harshness of winter. It's also attributable to the existence of kinships as assets of the people in the Pacific, and in Fiji, where the community views others within the community as theirs rather than separate individuals. It would be much easier for a native Fijian to borrow something from another within the community, and the other would be equally willing to part with something of value to fulfill their customary obligation to their kinship. Living in harmony with the community, with a large number of kin rather than individually, is a major reason for lack of savings within this community. Interestingly, we see Asians and Indians with similar income have been able to make reasonable savings by living in individualistic societies where materialism precedes kinship ties. Pursuing De Soto's model would necessitate a complete rethinking of contemporary land stewardship in favour of the individual perception of ownership and acquiescence to the global Western-influenced ideal. And is it so ideal? Does individualism and commercialism ensure the optimal sustainability of either the land or society in the relationship that God intended? I don't think so. This is the dilemma confronting developing nations and their populace. Political rationality all over the world is one of short-termism, paying but lip service to the underlying precarious sustainability of natural resources. It's more than 20 years since I hosted the FAO USP RICS Foundation South Pacific Land Tenure Conflict Symposium in Suva in April 2002. And one of the main strategies that came out of a declaration from that symposium was a need to explore and reach consensus on where people, citizens, wanted to be located between the extremes of traditional, customary ways and Western materialism. Inherent in this is that a society or nation can't have both. Well, I'm wondering if, since the 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, we're actually closer now to having a situation of both than maybe we were back in 2002. But yeah, we need to unpick that a little bit further, I think. Anyway, there's a possibility that a nation can evolve a hybridization that hopefully incorporates the best of both paradigms, but such a societal evolution inevitably incurs significant growing pains. My role here, and that of Krishn when we originally wrote our paper on this topic, was not actually to provide specific answers. I think that's important as well. Rather, what's more important is to ask the question about what we mean by ownership in a Pacific, Fijian, or Indigenous context. As Charles Darwin said, in questioning evolution, what is important is to ask the question, but there's no haste to provide the answer. I think in this case, the answers and the way forward will take time to manifest, but I think we've had 20 years and I haven't seen it becoming significantly clearer. In fact, if we take the Fiji example, it became clouded in many ways by having a military government, then a democratically elected government that used questionable approaches, and I struggled perhaps to understand what some of the intent was. Things like, I would suggest, the Native Land Trust Board, which I've alluded to already in this episode, the ITLTB, was diluted and impacted, because obviously we had a situation where the Prime Minister was a Minister for Fijian Affairs, and therefore he sat over as the chairman of the TLTB. And we've also had the disbandment of the Great Council of Chiefs, which was a higher house, and also the home, as well as being the higher house of Parliament or government, was also the home of discussion on customary issues in association with Ministry of what was Fijian, now iTaukei affairs. Earlier I introduced the suggestion that a subtle form of alienation, a passing to state control, did actually occur as part of Fiji's land tenure evolution. This argument is grounded on the changes that have transpired through colonisation and subsequent independence. Before the 1874 Deed of Cession, tribal control of land was well established, and territorial control in Fiji was determined by the law of a club. Land was controlled by chiefs who granted access to their obedient servants whilst retaining the authority to gift access to others through marriage or favour. Whether such gifts were a grant of individual ownership or not isn't actually clear. Such grants were certainly perceived as freehold by many Europeans who came with the dogma of their own land tenure systems, clearly seeing them as much better than the savage systems of society they'd come to plunder with a flag in their hand and an empire on their mind. It has to be borne in mind that settlers had only seen freehold estates, but may not have fully appreciated or understood that these estates were revertible to the Crown upon the non-existence of future heirs to the estates concerned. Similarly, that's the fee simple absolute impossession by grace to the Crown that I referred to before. Similarly, when the native owner alienated land, he only alienated the use of the land, as the native owner was only familiar with a system where you alienate the use of land until the occupant needs it, or the owner needs it, and for as long as the occupant wants to use it, but certainly not beyond their life, and not something that they could then sell on, alienate, transfer to others for material gain. So there's a real anomaly on the integration of two systems, and we've seen that in many, many countries around the world where customary land is concerned, where Indigenous people are concerned. It tends to be those with the power and control who write the laws, and normally those laws are in favour of the settlers rather than the Indigenous forebears. Anyway, to move on, pre-contact through the Deed of Cession was a period in which land was in abundance. It was a never-ending asset which had little materialistic value and required both toil and sweat to reap any benefits. Now, the above would suggest that pre-colonisation chiefs had what we understand from a Western perspective of ownership by virtue of control, albeit within a different, should I say, perception of nongu kulu nongu vanua than that which we understand today. Such was the unprecedented authority of the chief as God's representative on earth, or spiritual representative on earth. Land tenure patterns were fixed at the time of cession in 1874. The British Empire exercised their right to land ownership almost instantly. One of the first acts of the colonial government was to issue a notice to the effect that no sale, transfer or assignment of land would be recognised by the government until a decision had been made on the settlement of existing titles. After the signing of the Deed of Cession, rights of Fijians to the land were guaranteed. Likewise, rights of Europeans and other foreigners who had acquired land in a bona fide manner before cession were also recognised. This provided security of tenure and legitimised what we today know as the freehold lands in Fiji. In 1874, during the time of the cession, there were many foreign occupiers and claimants to large areas of Fijian land. These claims mostly originated through dealings with chiefs, traders and settlers. A commission under V.A. Williams was set up to investigate all claims during a time when about 400,000 acres of land was registered as freehold. The current land tenure patterns are based on the views of Sir Arthur Gordon, the first substantive governor of Fiji. He set up a framework establishing the Land Claims Commission, under which the validity of European claims were determined and the protection of native forms of tenure systems were recognised. And here it's important to actually think about what was achieved in Fiji with that recording, with what we know as the VKB now, the book, which has a listing of every native-born Fijian or native Fijian and their relationship to kin and land within the country. This, of course, is far advanced of the land recording, land registering, land titling systems in, I think, any other Pacific Island country. And it set Fiji apart, and it makes Fiji a wonderful case study as to what you can do and what maybe you shouldn't do, because obviously it created a concretization. We went from having a series of clans and chiefs who were often warring with one another to a system where those chiefs came together or were organised by the British settlers to agree to cede all the lands of Fiji to Queen Victoria. Now that of itself is problematic. And then the fact we had Westminster or English legal frameworks which are based on feudal systems supplanted into a very different framework, law that isn't codified in a Western sense in Fiji. And it's that pluralism that exists today that is both fascinating and challenging. And it's the pluralism that creates that anomaly between the extreme of custom and tradition and the extreme of commercialism and Western materialism. So it creates an interesting set of opportunities to think and discuss. Among the other issues at the time of cession, the Matangali was accepted as the main landowning unit in Fijian society. There were various ordinances and legislation following the Gordon policies. These included the Native Land Ordinance of 1880, under which alienation of all native land was prohibited. However, under various sections, provisions were made for Matangali land to be alienated to individual members of the clan if they desired to. It's probably worth mentioning the relevant sections. I think it was section 22 and section 24 of that ordinance of 1880. Thus, After holding a native certificate of title of the land for 5 years, a person was entitled to a crown grant of his land after. So it would cease to be native land, and with alienability ending, that land would then become what we know as freehold. Now, during the 1880s, due to an increase in land transactions, there was a need for all recognised land owned by Fijians to be recorded and registered together with settlement of issues such as boundary and ownership disputes, so way ahead of its time in many ways. Thus, under governing ordinance, the Native Lands Commission was established. The Native Lands Commission of 1905 and 1907 allowed customary law to apply to native land and ensured that Fijians could deal with native land in a customary manner. Im Firm, who was Governor-General from 1904 to 1910, tried to dismantle the system. In trying to dismantle the system of communal ownership, De Soto would have obviously been proud of Im Firm's reasons, which were grounded on communalism holding back modernisation and the lack of title, which precluded villagers from obtaining credit by using the land as security. In 1916, the Native Lands Commission failed again. The need for greater control over the leasing of native land and the provisions of greater security increased during the 1930s. In 1940, the Native Land Trust Ordinance established a new system for the administration of native land, known as I mentioned before, the Native Land Trust Board. It was responsible for administering the unreserved native land on behalf of the owners, including the subdivision of land, issues of leases, and collection and distribution of rent. The aims of the Native Land Trust Ordinance of 1940 were A. to ensure sufficient land remained in Fijian hands for Fijian use, and B. to make surplus land available for leasing to non-Fijians. Importantly, this created a social structural framework for Fijian landholding. You remember before I said that from a Deed of Cession Matangali was recognised, but what we see from 1940 onwards was recognition and the foundation of land policy in Fiji. It was formulated as recently as the 1939 sitting of the Native Land Commission and has been used since then. It gives us the Vanua, there's that multifarious word again, headed by the Turanga iTaukei. It gives us the Yavusa, which is tribal level, headed by the Turanga Nikali. It gives us the Matangali, which had been in existence or been in existence long before, but was recognised at the time of the Deed of Cession, and here it is being formalised in 1939 as the third tier, the clan tier, Matangali as clan, headed by the Turanga ni Matangali. And then you have the Toka, the smaller clan, below that. Now, this précis of the evolution of land tenure that I've been discussing raises several pertinent questions, such as who transferred a superior interest and lien to Queen Victoria were the signatories to the Deed of Cession. This suggests, and is commonly accepted, that the chiefs had the authority over and respect of their subjects to act on their behalf. However, let us cast our mind back to this period, 1874, and ask who the land belonged to at that time. One assumes the chiefs were the landowners, not the individual Fijians. Yet, this was a period in history when the concept of Indigenous landowners came into being. The 1939 Land Commission framework of aristocracy, with the Vanua, the Yavusa, the Matangali, the Toka, can be confusing. If parallels were to be drawn with other aristocracies around the globe, the superior interest would seemingly be vested in the Vanua, a word, as I said, that has apparent complexity of meanings. Accepting that the Vanua is headed by the Turanga iTaukei, this would lead to the assertion that in 1939 the Turanga iTaukei was the superior landowner, leaving it unclear what ownership rights the individual members of a Matangali or iTaukei actually held, both then and now. What's clear is that individual members of a Vanua certainly do not appear to be landowners, although collectively they could be taken to be part of a communal stewardship or co-guardianship. At a time when the Native Land Trust Board morphed into the iTaukei Land Trust Board and has been under the microscope, I would say, for the last 25 years, some critics argue that it may have outlived its usefulness, and we need to reflect on the real impact of the senior chiefs. Now, as I mentioned, the original intention was that the Native Land Trust Board would be chaired by members of the Great Council of Chiefs, or sorry, not chaired, would be chaired by the President, elected from the Great Council of Chiefs, and Great Council of Chiefs would be the members of the board. Now, this isn't completely so nowadays. We've seen, well, with the demise of the Great Council of Chiefs, which is under consideration for re-establishment currently, now in 2023, we see other parties appointed by government, mainly the previous government, to be on the board of the TLTB, the iTaukei Land Trust Board. And we went for a period where we saw the Prime Minister, Frank Bainimarama, also holding a position of Minister of iTaukei Affairs. There has been some delegated power from the President for the Minister to be the chairman of the board of the iTaukei Land Trust Board. And what we have now seen is a change where, under the current government from 2022, we see that the Prime Minister is no longer the chairman of the iTaukei Land Trust Board. So the newly appointed Minister for iTaukei Affairs, the Honourable Liferemi Vasu, should take over as the chairman of the Board of Trustees. And I think he's joined notionally by 5 members appointed by the government, 3 members appointed by the Ministry of iTaukei Affairs from provincial representation. So the iTaukei Land Trust Board, even though it no longer has a Prime Minister, also in the role of chairman of the board, we have an Honourable Minister chairing the board and 5 members, elected by the current government. That means that we do have something of a political influence on the activities of the iTaukei Land Trust Board. Now, the whole intention is to act on behalf and in the best interests of the landowners. And yes, the statute uses that language that perpetuates the myth that we're talking about, is an interesting veneer of the stewardship cycle. Who is the iTaukei Land Trust Board accountable to? The Vanua, the government, the individual Indigenous Fijian? Can they be accountable to the multiple aspirations of a multiplicity of masters? Perhaps it's even more complicated than that. did the Native Land Trust Ordinance of 1940 and the establishment of the NLTB, Native Land Trust Board, now iTaukei Land Trust Board, effectively and neatly transfer the rights of the Vanua to the NLTB, whilst ensuring that any net proceeds are distributed back to the Vanua in accordance with a proportional formula based on the 1939 aristocratic hierarchy, chiefly hierarchy from the Vanua, Yavusa, Matangali and Toka Toka. Apparently so. As the Native Land Trust Ordinance gave the NLTB the authority to make leasing decisions without recourse to individual Matangali, as the NLTB had the statutory delegated authority of the Vanua. The place of the NLTB employees in traditional society has in most cases resulted in the NLTB now succumbing, albeit unnecessarily, to custom through their tokenism of seeking approval for their actions from various levels of the aristocracy. Such custom and practice is certainly under question, as the TLTB strives for greater efficiency and aspirations of commercialism with the re-establishment of Native Land Development Corporations, Vanua Land Development Corporations as commercial arms. So the Native Land Trust Board has got a collection of professionals in law, valuation, property management, mapping, negotiation, lease management, etc., who are trained and in place to represent the customary landowners. But of course it begs a question over who has the authority. The TLTB, the state, the landowners as they understand themselves, the Matangali, the Toka Toka, members of the Toka Toka, the Yavusa, the Vanua. If we provide the legal precedents, it gets interesting, particularly in determining the rights of those that claim to be landowners. In the case of Mele Kaliavu and others versus the NLTB in 1956, the plaintiffs were 5 members belonging to the Matan Ivuga Matangali. Their claim was for damages and in an injunction to stop the NLTB from granting a lease of a portion of land owned by the Matan Ivuga Matangali. This action was commenced by the plaintiffs as members of their Matangali within their personal capacities. Now, Justice Hammett determined that members of a Matangali could not sue on behalf of a Matangali in their own personal capacity to recover damages, which the Matangali may have suffered. Now, Justice Hammett also commented that this did not mean that the Matangali could not recover the damages sustained. The liability for any damages sustained by the Matangali through the actions of the NLTB, would make the NLTB liable, and the Matangali could recover them. However, members in their personal capacity did not have the locus standi, the legal status, to represent the Matangali. Now, this case was well before independence in Fiji, and it saw the erosion of some rights of control of members of the Matangali when it came to deciding as to whether to lease a particular piece of land to someone or not. In addition, this case portrays the shift of decision-making power from the members of the Matangali in the communal way to an individualistic decision of the Native Land Trust Board. Meanwhile, 1970 saw independence and political nationhood come into play in Fiji. Today, it's hard to separate the role and place of the NLTB, or TLTB, from the politics of government, given the role of both the President and the Minister of Fijian Affairs, as was from the period of 2006 through to 2022, who was also the Prime Minister, on the Native Land Trust Board, or iTaukei Land Trust Board. As Supreme Chief of the Vanua, the President has much to gain from his aristocratic hierarchy and proceeds generated by the TLTB on whose behalf? His behalf? Likewise, the Minister for iTaukei Affairs is in a position to influence the TLTB politically. Moreover, the involvement of the head of state and minister interweaves national interests into the operation. As a tool of the state, this would suggest that the TLTB's authority effectively vests land control, if not full conventional ownership, in the state. Now, at this point in the dialogue, the social imperatives of communalism appear to move close to the socialist definition of communism, for as we've alluded, if there's no such thing as an individual owner of native land, does the legislation effectively mean that control and real ownership of the land is really vested in the state? It's clearly not straightforward. One can look at the post-independence decision in the case of Timothy Bavandra versus the NLTB in 1986, where Justice Rooney affirmed that not only could Matangali members not sue in their own personal capacities, but also that a Matangali in itself was not an entity which had legal personality. Thus, a Matangali could not even bring actions in court as representative actions by its members, for one cannot give what he or she doesn't have in the first place. Justice Rooney declared in his decision that as a Matangali didn't have legal personality, it could not give others the right of representing it when it does not have such a right itself. This decision was reinforced by Nemisio Dikau versus NLTB in 1986, where members of a Matangali brought an action both in their personal capacities as members and in their representative capacity as representatives of other members of a Matangali. They were once again clearly declared as not having locus to bring a case seeking damages, declarations and costs. Now, the above case law highlights that those claiming to be landowners in Fiji are not even allowed to bring actions in the courts in Fiji as communal owners. These actions are declined both when brought forward as personal actions and when brought in as representative actions of a Matangali or its members. Whatever the myth surrounding land ownership may be, the legal scenario is clear in that communal landowners have no place in the courts in the Fiji Islands when it comes to exercising rights as landowners. So who can bring claims on behalf of those who proclaim to be landowners? The answer's clear. It's the landowner. Well, that's not that clear, but it's clear. It's the landowner. This again raises the question as to who is the landowner. Is it the president as the head of the Vanua? Is it the Native Land Trust Board, iTaukei Land Trust Board, or the state? Despite how agitated native owners, or rather guardians, may feel about this question, the legal precedents determine that all native land is legally owned by the Native Land Trust Board, or iTaukei Land Trust Board, as the legal owner and rightful litigant for all claims regarding native land. The feared warriors who controlled the land and claimed ownership until the Deed of Cession are apparently nothing more than toothless tigers who claim to have ownership, albeit that they have neither control nor legal redress. We could question if this is the reality that was actually intended, but history and legal precedent has brought us to the current scenario. In the case of Waisaki Ratu and others versus the NLTB in 1984, Justice Cullinan stated that he would not be willing to interpret that the Parliament of Fiji intended that native owners, comprising more than half the population and owning more than, he said, 85% of the lands, were to be excluded from the courts. Due to their population size and their land holdings, they had to have representation. Yet when Justice Rooney gave his decision in Nemisio Dika versus NLTB, he clearly stated that because 85% of the land holdings were controlled by Fijians, who were more than half the population, they had to be excluded from the courts, as not doing so would cause chaos. The answer thus lies in the fact that land tenure systems are man-made, or human-made, and they evolved to serve the needs of the people over time. Whilst they're man-made, human-made, those who have most to gain from their operation tend to be the ones who make the rules. The system is made to accommodate the particular way of life of the people, laws, and most importantly, the physical environment. They're subject to change and modification and should be transmitted from generation to generation with efficient modification. When the ordinary individual who's been seduced by myth and embeddedness of misunderstanding comes to realize that they don't actually own anything other than a lifelong right of occupation and obligation that comes with that occupation, there may be a revolution, or at least evolution, and a clarion call for modification. But this will only happen when the majority decide where they want to be placed between the extremes of traditional customary ways and of Western materialism. That's both a society and nation-changing decision, and one that shouldn't be taken lightly. What is important is that the questions are asked, and that people are aware of their rights and obligations under the status quo, and what those rights and obligations might be under any subsequent modification. So in closing, it's appropriate to return to the concept of nongo kalu, nongo venua. Earlier, we accepted that God does not belong to the people, but people would like to believe that they belong to God. It follows that the land does not belong to the people, rather the people belong to the land. Powerful stuff, and a lot to think about. As is normal in the Customary Land podcast, we're talking about issues that touch on law, society, culture, economics, value, particularly when it comes to issues surrounding land. So it's important that I close out, as previously, with a disclaimer that the views and insights and opinions shared on the Customary Land podcast are those of the host and any guests and others they may cite. They don't constitute legal or financial advice and should not be construed as such by any individual, group or organisation. Before undertaking any dealing or action relating to customary land, individuals, groups or organisations should obtain independent professional advice from a qualified lawyer, experienced valuer and/or certified chartered accountant with specialist expertise in your particular country. Alternatively, you can contact Customary Land Solutions for advocacy, advisory and capacity building solutions for customary and Indigenous landowning groups and trusts on land management, leasehold, valuation and resource compensation issues. The contact for Customary Land Solutions is contact@customarylandsolutions, all one word, .com. Thanks for listening. If anything's come up that you'd like to reach out to me about, you can contact me at contact@thecustomarylandpodcast.com. So until the next episode, stay safe, stay well, and thanks for listening.